The year was 1889, and in the quiet rolling hills of rural Kentucky, life was marked by simplicity, hard labor, and a deep reliance on faith. Families rose with the sun, worked the fields until their hands were raw, and returned home to wooden cabins lit only by lanterns. News traveled slowly, and doctors were often days away. In such a world, childbirth was not only a blessing but also a gamble, one where the lives of both mother and child were always at risk. In this setting, a young couple, Samuel and Martha, awaited the birth of their child. They were ordinary people, struggling farmers, with little money but an abundance of hope. The land they tilled was rocky, and the harvest often uncertain, but they believed a new baby would bring them joy and a reason to endure life's hardships. Their neighbors whispered prayers for a safe delivery, for it was well known that many women of the time never survived the ordeal. When the day arrived, Martha endured hours of labor inside the small log cabin. The midwife, an elderly woman with years of experience, worked tirelessly by her side. Finally, the cries of newborns filled the air, but instead of one child, there were two, twins. The family should have celebrated, for twins were rare and considered a double blessing. But as the midwife held the infants up to the flickering lantern light, gasps replaced joy. The babies were joined together at the chest, sharing what seemed to be one body with two beating hearts. No one in that part of Kentucky had ever seen such a thing. Conjoined twins were so rare that even doctors in cities like Louisville or Cincinnati barely understood them. To the rural folk, it was something unnatural, a mystery of God, or worse, a curse. The midwife crossed herself, whispering prayers under her breath. Martha, exhausted yet determined, reached for her daughters and cradled them to her chest. She didn't see a curse. She saw life, two little souls crying for their mother's warmth. Samuel, however, stood frozen. He had imagined children who could run in the fields, help with the farm, and carry on his name. Instead, he now stared at what neighbors might call monstrosities. In the silence of that moment, Samuel's heart battled between love and shame. He loved his daughters instinctively, yet feared the cruelty of the world that awaited them. Word spread quickly. By the next morning, curious neighbors gathered outside the cabin. Some wanted to see the freakish birth with their own eyes. Others came with pity, and a few with superstition. One old man muttered, "This ain't natural. Such things don't survive long." Another whispered that God was punishing the family for some hidden sin. The cruel judgment stung Samuel deeply. In the close-knit rural community, reputation was everything, and now he felt marked. For Martha, though, there was no shame. As she rocked her daughters, she whispered soft lullabies. She named them Clara and Grace, believing that if they were strong enough to enter the world against all odds, then surely God had a plan for them. She cleaned their tiny faces, dressed them in handmade cloth, and swore she would not let society decide their worth. The following weeks tested every ounce of the parents' strength. Feeding the twins was complicated, as one often choked when the other nursed. They suffered frequent fevers, and every cry sent waves of panic through the small cabin. Martha hardly slept, watching over them like a guardian. Samuel provided as best as he could, yet the weight of whispers in the town ate at him daily. He overheard men at the mill say things like, "Better if they hadn't lived. Such children won't survive the winter anyway." Despite the bleakness, the twins fought on. They clung to life with surprising resilience. Each morning, their cries grew louder, their tiny eyes brighter. By the end of the first month, Clara's small hand reached for Grace, and Grace's lips curled into what looked like the faintest smile. It was as if they already knew that their strength would come not from being separate, but from being together. Medical knowledge in 1889 could offer no help. In big cities, a surgeon might have attempted a risky separation, but in rural Kentucky, the very idea was unthinkable. So the family adapted. Martha learned to carry them wrapped tightly against her chest. Samuel fashioned a wooden cradle wide enough to support them both. Every small adjustment became an act of survival, a testimony to human willpower in the face of impossible odds. As the months passed, Clara and Grace grew stronger. The community, though still skeptical, began to soften. Some neighbors would peek through the door and leave food or milk, perhaps out of pity. but also out of growing admiration. For the twins did not resemble a curse anymore. They resembled perseverance. Every laugh they shared, every time they clapped their small hands in unison, chipped away at the fear surrounding them. What began as shock and shame slowly transformed into awe. The story of the Hilton sisters, the conjoined twins of Kentucky, spread beyond their little town. Travelers passing through would ask to see them, not out of cruelty, but out of amazement that such fragile lives had endured. Clara and Grace, once viewed as unwanted, now carried a powerful lesson that life, no matter how different, is still sacred. The rare birth of 1889 was more than a medical anomaly. It was a mirror reflecting the best and worst of humanity. It showed how fear can drive people to judgment, but also how love can overcome that fear. Samuel, who once wrestled with shame, began to see his daughters not as burdens but as proof of resilience. And Martha, who never doubted them, stood as a symbol of a mother's unshakable faith. In the end, what made this birth truly rare was not only the science of conjoined twins, but the courage it demanded. Courage to protect the innocent, to defy social scorn, and to believe that every life, however fragile or different, carries meaning. Samuel Hilton was not a cruel man by nature. He was like most farmers in Kentucky in the late 1800s, hard-handed, sunburnt, and weary from endless labor. Every day he woke before dawn, worked his rocky farmland until dusk, and returned home with aching bones and a mind burdened by survival. Life in 1889 was not kind to the poor. Crops failed often, livestock died from disease, and even the smallest accident could leave a man crippled without hope of recovery. Poverty was not simply a condition. It was a storm that followed families generation after generation. When Clara and Grace were born, Samuel's heart split in two. On one hand, he felt a surge of fatherly pride. They were his blood, his daughters, a living continuation of his existence. On the other hand, fear and shame pierced his soul. He had dreamed of children who would run through the fields, strong and healthy, helping him plow, sow, and harvest. Instead, he saw two frail girls joined together in a way no man in his community could understand. The neighbors' whispers were knives in his ears. God's punishment, some said, or natural, muttered others. One man, crueler than most, told Samuel to his face, "Best thing you can do is not let him suffer long." Those words replayed in his head at night as he sat silently by the fire, watching his daughters sleep in their wide cradle. Inside him, two voices battled constantly. The first was the voice of love. It urged him to protect them, to ignore the gossip, to see his daughters as nothing less than miracles. When Clara's tiny hand gripped his finger, when Grace turned her face toward the warmth of his chest, that love overwhelmed him. In those moments, he swore he would work twice as hard to give them a chance at life. But the second voice was darker. It whispered of shame, of poverty, of the ridicule that would never end. It reminded him of his failing crops, of how little food already sat on the table, of how much harder it would be to raise not one, not two, but two children bound as one. This voice told him he had been cursed, that the burden was too great, that his manhood and dignity were being stripped away. Every day, the struggle grew heavier. When Samuel went into town for supplies, men avoided his eyes or smirked behind his back. Women crossed themselves when he passed, muttering prayers as if evil followed him. His children were not seen as children. They were seen as curiosities, mistakes of nature. That humiliation festered in Samuel's chest, turning his heart harder each day. At home, Martha's optimism was like a flame against his darkness. She sang to the twins, kissed their foreheads, and spoke to them as though they were gifts sent directly from heaven. Samuel admired her strength but felt crushed by it too. How could she bear the weight so gracefully while he staggered under it? Her faith sometimes made him feel smaller, weaker, and more ashamed. It was during one of the coldest nights of winter that Samuel's breaking point came. The crops had failed again, and money was gone. The twins were sick with fever, their tiny bodies shivering against each other. The doctor refused to travel the distance, dismissing the effort as pointless. Samuel sat in the corner of the cabin, watching Martha cradle them by the fire, her lullabies trembling with worry. The darker voice inside him grew louder, screaming now instead of whispering. That night, Samuel walked outside into the biting wind. The axe stood buried in the chopping block, its wooden handle slick with frost. He stared at it for a long time. To his tormented mind, the axe no longer looked like a tool. It looked like a solution. With one blow, he thought, he could free himself, his wife, and even his daughters from the endless suffering. They would not grow to be mocked, stared at, or treated like monsters. They would not live in hunger or shame. The world would not laugh at the Hilton family anymore. His hand gripped the handle. He imagined stepping inside, raising the blade high, and ending the burden once and for all. The thought chilled him more than the winter air, but it also tempted him. He felt his heart pounding, his breath ragged. The struggle within him reached its peak. The love of a father against the despair of a broken man. As Samuel turned back toward the cabin, axe in hand, the glow of the fire lit the window. Through it, he saw Martha. She was still awake, holding Clara and Grace close against her chest, singing softly despite her exhaustion. Her eyes were heavy, her body weak, yet her face shone with an unshakable tenderness. She looked not at their deformity, not at their weakness, but at their humanity. Samuel froze. For the first time, he saw his daughters not as burdens or objects of shame, but as living souls cradled in their mother's arms. They were not curses. They were his children. His shame had blinded him to the simplest truth. They were innocent, they were alive, and they were his to protect. The axe slipped from his hand, falling to the snow with a dull thud. Samuel fell to his knees, tears spilling down his face, his breath turning to clouds in the cold night air. In that moment, the battle inside him ended. Love had won. The darkness that nearly consumed him was broken by the fragile light of his daughter's existence. From that night on, Samuel still struggled, but he no longer carried the axe in his heart. The whispers of neighbors remained, poverty persisted, and the challenges of raising Clara and Grace did not lessen. Yet, his perspective shifted. Instead of asking, "Why me?" he began asking, "How can I protect them?" Instead of despairing at what others thought, he found strength in what his daughters were becoming. Symbols of endurance, living proof that even in the harshest conditions, life could flourish. The dark struggle of Samuel Hilton was not about his daughters. It was about his own soul, his battle between weakness and strength, fear and love. In conquering that battle, he discovered a truth that outlives him. A father's greatest weapon is not an axe, but the courage to love when the world gives him every reason not to. The winter of 1890 in Kentucky was bitter, unforgiving, and heavy with silence. Snow covered the fields where crops should have grown, and the Hilton cabin creaked under the weight of the cold wind. Inside, the fire burned low, barely strong enough to warm the room. Samuel Hilton sat hunched on a wooden stool, his rough hands pressed together, his gaze fixed on the axe leaning against the door. That axe was no stranger to him. It was the tool that kept his family alive, splitting firewood for heat, cutting timber for repairs, even protecting the farm when needed. But now, in Samuel's mind, the axe had transformed into something darker. It became the symbol of an impossible choice. For months, Samuel had been torn apart by the reality of his daughters, Clara and Grace. Born conjoined at the chest, they were a miracle of life and yet a mystery that brought endless stares, whispers, and ridicule. Some neighbors pitied them, others mocked them openly. Work in the fields had become harder for Samuel because no one would hire a man whose family was cursed. His pride, once the strongest thing he carried, was now crushed under the weight of judgment and poverty. The girls themselves, however, had begun to show signs of resilience. They laughed together, cried together, and reached for their mother's arms in unison. To Martha, their mother, they were nothing less than angels. She spent her days humming lullabies, teaching them to smile, and convincing herself that love could conquer the cruel eyes of the world. But Samuel's heart carried a shadow that grew darker with each passing day. He had convinced himself that he was protecting his daughters by considering the unthinkable. What kind of life, he thought, awaited them in a world so harsh, so unforgiving? Would they ever walk freely without being mocked? Would they ever live without pain or without being paraded as curiosities? Wouldn't it be kinder to end it now, before the world devoured them alive? One night, when the cabin was silent and Martha had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, Beside the cradle, Samuel rose. The axe was waiting, its wooden handle gleaming faintly in the firelight. He wrapped his fingers around it, the weight familiar, the decision foreign. His heart pounded like a drum. His thoughts raced, torn between love and despair. As he stepped closer to the cradle, the fire flickered, casting shadows across the room. The twins stirred in their sleep, their small hands brushing against each other, as if instinctively holding on. Samuel froze. His grip on the axe tightened, but so did the knot in his chest. He could hear two voices inside him again. One voice whispered, "Eat it now. Spare them from ridicule. Spare yourself from shame. Spare your wife from endless suffering. One swing, and it's over." The other voice cried, "They are your daughters. They are breathing, living, innocent souls. You are their father, not their executioner. Do not let despair become their killer." Samuel's hands shook violently. The axe hovered, not yet raised, but heavy with possibility. His breath came in sharp gasps, his eyes blurred with tears. He wanted to believe the darker voice because it seemed easier. It promised an end to suffering. But deep down he knew it was not truth. It was cowardice dressed as mercy. In that fragile moment a sound broke the silence. It was not thunder or wind, but Martha's soft voice. She had woken and was watching him from the bed. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with sorrowful understanding. She didn't scream. She didn't lunge to stop him. Instead, she whispered words that pierced through his torment. Samuel put it down. "They are not your burden. They are our blessing." Her voice trembled, but it carried the strength of a mother's faith. She rose and walked to the cradle, lifting Clara and Grace into her arms. The babies stirred, their weak cries filling the cabin. Martha kissed their foreheads and turned to Samuel. "They don't need an axe," she said firmly. "They need a father." Samuel's knees buckled. The axe slipped from his grasp, crashing onto the wooden floor with a thud that echoed like a gunshot. He collapsed beside it, his face buried in his calloused hands. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, streamed down his cheeks. For the first time since their birth, Samuel let himself weep openly, not from shame, but from the unbearable weight of almost making the wrong choice. Martha knelt beside him, placing the twins gently in his arms. Their tiny bodies pressed against his chest, their warmth seeping into him like sunlight breaking through a storm. In that moment, Samuel felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. Hope. The decision was no longer about ending suffering. It was about embracing responsibility. He realized that the axe had never been the real enemy. The enemy was the despair that had taken root inside him. The axe was only its tool. By choosing to let it fall to the ground, Samuel had made his true decision, to fight not against his daughters, but for them. From that night onward, the axe remained outside, back in the chopping block where it belonged. Samuel never again thought of it as a solution. Instead, he poured his strength into the fields, into repairing the cabin, into standing beside Martha as they raised Clara and Grace together. The world outside would not grow kinder overnight, but Samuel had grown stronger inside. He learned that the measure of a father was not in how he avoided hardship, but in how he faced it with love. His daughters' lives might be difficult, but they would not be defined by shame or despair. They would be defined by the strength of parents who refused to give up. The decision Samuel made that night did not just save Clara and Grace. It saved him. It turned his story from one of tragedy into one of courage. It showed that even in the darkest hour, when the axe is raised and despair whispers loudly, a single choice rooted in love can change the course of destiny. The winter that had almost claimed their fate finally passed, and with the coming of spring in 1890, the Hilton family faced a new season not only of nature but of life itself. Clara and Grace, the conjoined daughters born into doubt and whispers, were still alive, a fact that in itself felt like a miracle. Few believed they would survive their first days, fewer still their first weeks. Yet here they were, their cries filling the cabin each morning, their laughter breaking through the silence of the fields. Survival, however, was not simple. The twins required constant care that tested the very limits of Samuel and Martha's endurance. Feeding them was an art in itself. If Clara nursed too quickly, Grace would choke. If Grace turned her head, Clara would cry in frustration. Martha learned to cradle them just right, one arm supporting their shared chest, the other balancing their heads. She barely slept, often dozing in a chair while holding them upright against her body so they could breathe easier during bouts of coughing or fever. Illness was a constant threat. Rural Kentucky had little access to doctors, and even when one could be found, most refused to treat the twins. To them, such children were curiosities, not patients. One physician bluntly told Samuel, "There's nothing I can do. Nature will decide soon enough." Those words haunted Samuel, but Martha refused to surrender. She brewed herbal teas, wrapped the girls in warm blankets, and prayed over them night after night. The world outside their cabin was no kender. Whenever Samuel brought his family to town for supplies, the stares were merciless. Children pointed, adults whispered. Some crossed the street to avoid them, as though the twins' condition were contagious. A few bolder and crueler laughed outright. Two-headed girls. One boy shouted once, and the sound followed Samuel all the way back home like a curse. Yet, in the face of all this, Clara and Grace began to grow stronger. By the time they were 2 years old, their laughter was contagious. They developed little games with each other, clapping their hands in rhythm, giggling when one sneezed or hiccuped. Where one struggled, the other offered balance. Clara had a stronger right arm, Grace steadier legs. Together, they learned to sit, crawl, and eventually take small, wobbling steps with Martha guiding them. Each milestone felt monumental, a victory against the world's doubts. Samuel, though hardened by years of struggle, found his heart softening. Each time he saw them stand or clap, he remembered the night he nearly chose despair over hope. The axe that once tempted him to end their lives now served only to chop wood for their fire. It was as though the very tool of destruction had been redeemed into a symbol of survival. The family's endurance began to inspire, even among neighbors who once mocked them. A woman who had gossiped cruelly in the early days quietly began leaving bread by their doorstep. An old man who had dismissed the twins as unnatural offered Samuel extra seed for his fields one spring. Slowly, grudgingly, the community began to see not monstrosities, but children. Still, survival was more than physical, it was spiritual. Samuel and Martha knew that their daughters' lives would always be harder than most. But they also understood something profound. Hardship was not the same as hopelessness. Each day the twins woke, laughed, or learned something new was proof that life, even when fragile and unusual, could be deeply meaningful. By the time Clara and Grace reached the age of 5, they had already outlived every grim prediction. Instead of fading quietly, they became a source of fascination, not the cruel kind, but the admiring kind. Travelers passing through the county would stop to ask about the Hilton sisters. Some even knocked on the cabin door, hoping to glimpse the miracle children. Samuel, protective as ever, turned most away, but in his heart, he realized something important. What once brought shame could now inspire awe. The sisters' bond deepened with every passing year. They spoke in unison sometimes, finishing each other's sentences. When Clara cried, Grace would reach to wipe her tears. When Grace stumbled, Clara steadied her with a determined grip. Their very existence was a living sermon about unity, about how strength could be forged from inseparable struggle. For Samuel and Martha, their daughters became teachers as much as children. Samuel learned that survival was not about avoiding hardship, but enduring it with dignity. Martha discovered that faith was not just belief in God, but belief in the value of life itself, no matter how unusual. Together, they came to see that Clara and Grace were not accidents of nature. They were reminders that every soul is crafted with purpose. The Hilton sisters' survival became more than a private victory for one family. It began to ripple outward, touching neighbors, travelers, and eventually entire communities. Stories spread of the little girls who were born conjoined, whose father once nearly ended their lives, and who now thrived against every prediction. People began to see them not as cursed but as chosen to remind the world that even the most fragile lives can carry powerful strength. By surviving, Clara and Grace had already accomplished something extraordinary. They had defeated the whispers, the judgments, the predictions of death. They had proven that survival is not merely about drawing breath, but about living in defiance of every odd stacked against you. in their smiles, their laughter, and their tiny steps across the wooden floor of that Kentucky cabin, the world could see a truth that could not be denied. Survival is not given. It is fought for, day by day, against every shadow of despair, and in that fight, even the weakest can become stronger than anyone dares to imagine. By the mid-1890s, Clara and Grace Hilton had already lived far beyond the grim predictions of doctors and neighbors. What was once expected to be a life of days, or at most weeks, had stretched into years of resilience. At 7 years old, the sisters were no longer fragile infants clinging to survival. They were children with laughter in their voices, curiosity in their eyes, and courage stitched into their very being. They were not like other children, of course. Every step required balance, every movement demanded compromise, and every day brought a reminder of their condition. Yet, instead of allowing these challenges to crush them, Clara and Grace turned their unusual bond into their greatest strength. They had no choice but to move together, eat together, and live as one. And in that togetherness, they discovered a courage that most people never learn in a lifetime. At first, their courage was quiet and unnoticed. It was in the way they learned to walk, wobbling at first, but soon steadying each other with small hands and determined steps. It was in their shared laughter when one stumbled, and the other instinctively steadied her. It was in their ability to face ridicule without bitterness, their wide eyes looking not with anger at those who mocked them, but with curiosity, as if wondering why others could not see the beauty in their unity. But courage, when practiced daily, cannot remain hidden for long. Soon, neighbors began to take notice. The same families who once whispered behind closed doors now found themselves humbled by the sisters' perseverance. People who had dismissed them as unnatural were forced to admit that there was something undeniably inspiring about two little girls who carried such burdens with such grace. One summer afternoon, when the community gathered for a church picnic, Clara and Grace attended with their parents. It was the first time they had appeared so openly among the crowd. Samuel, still protective, worried how the children might react. But as the sisters walked hand in hand, though their hands were already joined by nature, silence fell. The laughter of the picnic dimmed, the whispers began, and then something remarkable happened. The girls started to sing. Their voices, though young and untrained, blended together in harmony. Clara carried the higher notes, while Grace's tone was softer and steadier. Together, their song rose above the whispers and filled the air with a sound that silenced mockery. Children who had once pointed at them now listened in awe. Adults who had scorned them now wiped away unexpected tears. By the time their song ended, the silence was no longer heavy with judgment. It was filled with admiration. From that day forward, the Hilton sisters were no longer viewed merely as curiosities. They became symbols of courage. Their presence challenged people to see beyond physical limitations and to confront their own prejudices. For every cruel laugh that had once followed them, there now came nods of respect, offers of help, and even invitations to share their story. Their courage extended beyond simply surviving ridicule. They began to participate in community life in ways no one expected. Clara and Grace learned to read together, turning pages in unison, giggling when one tried to read faster than the other. They practiced sewing with their mother, working as a pair to stitch cloth. They even helped Samuel on the farm in small ways, carrying baskets of eggs or gathering firewood. Each task that others said they could not do became another opportunity to prove them wrong. What made their courage remarkable was not just that they endured difficulties, but that they did so with joy. They laughed more than they cried, sang more than they complained, and faced each challenge with a determination that inspired all who watched. They were living proof that courage is not the absence of fear or hardship, but the decision to move forward despite it. As their story spread beyond Kentucky, travelers came to hear about the sisters. Some came out of curiosity, others out of genuine admiration. Ministers spoke of them in sermons as examples of God's mysterious blessings. Local newspapers carried short notes about the Hilton twins who defied every expectation. Though still children, Clara and Grace were slowly becoming more than survivors. They were becoming teachers. They taught their community that what seems like weakness can become strength. They taught their parents that despair can be transformed into hope. And they taught strangers that courage is not measured by how normal you appear, but by how bravely you face a life that is far from ordinary. Even Samuel, who once wrestled with despair so dark he nearly raised the axe against them, found himself transformed by their courage. Where once he had seen only shame, he now saw pride. Where once he had feared their future, he now believed in it. He walked taller in town, his head held high, no longer the man burdened by whispers, but the father of 2 daughters who inspired even the hardest of hearts. Their courage became contagious. A widowed neighbor who had given up on life after losing her husband found hope again, saying, "If those little girls can smile through their struggles, surely I can bear mine." A crippled war veteran in town began visiting them often, telling others, "They remind me that courage is not in the body, but in the spirit." Clara and Grace did not set out to change hearts, but they did. Simply by living bravely, by laughing loudly, and by facing each day together, they showed the world that courage is not rare. It is within reach of anyone willing to choose it. By the turn of the century, the Hilton sisters were no longer just surviving against the odds. They were shaping the hearts of those around them. They had moved from symbols of pity to symbols of strength. Their courage had become a mirror, forcing others to ask themselves, if these girls can carry such burdens with grace, what excuse do I have to give up on my own struggles? In the end, their greatest gift was not their survival, but the inspiration they gave to others. Their courage became a light in a world often darkened by judgment, showing that even those who are most different can become the ones who inspire us most deeply. History often remembers kings, wars, and inventions, but sometimes the greatest lessons come from the lives of ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances. The story of Clara and Grace Hilton, the Conjoined sisters born in 1889 Kentucky, is one such tale. Their lives, fragile yet enduring, remind us that the true value of a human being is not measured by perfection, but by resilience, courage, and the choices of those who surround them. When we look back at their beginnings, it is tempting to see only tragedy. Born joined at the chest in an era without medical science to separate them, they were immediately judged by the harsh eyes of society. Their father nearly gave in to despair, tempted to silence their existence with the swing of an axe. Neighbors whispered of curses, punishments, and shame. Every odd was against them: poverty, illness, ridicule, and the ignorance of a world unprepared to embrace difference. And yet, despite all of this, they lived. More than that, they thrived. Their lives remind us of a truth many of us forget: every soul matters. In a society that often measures worth by beauty, wealth, or ability, Clara and Grace stood as living proof that value is not found in what the world calls normal. Their worth was in their humanity, in their ability to smile, to laugh, to teach others about perseverance. The real lesson for us lies first in the transformation of their father, Samuel. He began as a man torn apart by shame, nearly consumed by despair. With the axe in his hand, he stood at the edge of becoming his daughter's destroyer. But in choosing to let love win, he became their protector. That choice changed not only the lives of Clara and Grace, but his own. It shows us something powerful. We are always one decision away from changing the course of our lives. One moment of compassion, one act of courage can turn tragedy into triumph. How many of us today carry our own axe in silence? For some, it is the temptation to give up on a dream. For others, it is the weight of despair whispering that life is too hard to bear. Some may even hold the axe of bitterness, ready to cut away relationships or opportunities out of fear. Samuel's story calls us to put the axe down, to choose not destruction, but protection, to fight not against life, but for it. The Hilton sisters also teach us about unity. Where one was weak, the other was strong. They learned to move together, balance together, live together. Their lives were a constant reminder that we are not meant to face struggles alone. Too often, society glorifies independence as the ultimate strength. But Clara and Grace reveal another truth: real strength is found in togetherness. We all need someone to lean on, someone to balance us when we stumble. Their courage was not just personal, it was shared, and that made it unbreakable. For the community around them, the sisters forced people to confront their prejudices. At first, they were mocked, hidden, and rejected. But over time, their resilience melted cruelty into admiration. The same neighbors who once whispered eventually began to respect and even draw inspiration from them. This reflects a lesson that echoes into our modern world. When we dare to live authentically, no matter how different we are, we force the world to rethink its judgments. Our lives can be sermons louder than words, challenging others to grow beyond their ignorance. On a larger scale, the story of Clara and Grace is a mirror for each of us. How often do we measure our worth by comparing ourselves to others? How often do we see our limitations as curses instead of opportunities? The Hilton sisters show us that limitations are not walls. They are doors to discovering new kinds of strength. Their lives declare, you may not be able to do everything, but you can do something, and that something can change the world around you. Their survival also speaks to the power of faith and persistence. Martha, their mother, refused to see them as burdens. She believed they were blessings when no one else did. Her unshakable love carried them through fevers, hunger, and ridicule. That is another lesson for us. Sometimes the world only learns to believe in us because someone close refuses to stop believing. Each of us can be that person. The one who stands in faith when others walk away, the one who speaks life when others predict failure. At its heart, the story of the Hilton sisters is not about deformity or survival. It is about choices. A father chose love over despair. A mother chose faith over fear. Two little girls chose laughter over sorrow. And together those choices created a legacy that still speaks over a century later. So what is the real lesson for us? It is this. No matter how broken life seems, it is never beyond redemption. No matter how dark the night feels, the dawn can still break if we hold on. No matter how different or limited we feel, we still carry within us the power to inspire. The Hilton sisters' story is not just their own. It belongs to anyone who has ever felt judged, unwanted, or out of place. It belongs to anyone who has ever stood at the edge of despair with an axe in hand, tempted to give up. It belongs to anyone who wonders whether their life truly matters. And their answer, lived out in every smile, every step, and every act of courage, is simple but profound. Yes, every life matters. Every choice matters. Every act of love matters. Let us then carry their lesson into our own lives. Let us put down the axes of despair and pick up the tools of hope. Let us see worth not in perfection, but in perseverance. And let us remember that sometimes the most unlikely lives carry the most powerful truths. The Hilton sisters were born conjoined, but in their unity, they revealed a message for all of humanity. We survive, not by destroying what seems difficult, but by embracing it with courage. And in doing so, we not only change our own lives, we change the lives of everyone who dares to witness our journey.